Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back to Dissensus, episode 6 of Dissensus, the show where we don't have to agree, and we don't have to agree to disagree. We can just talk about stuff. Returning for this episode is the always delightful Christine Brophy. We are once again attempting to constrain ourselves in time. So that's 85 minutes. Work, you. Okay, there we go. Work you. So theoretically, when this beeps, we have to stop. And that's how we're going to constrain things. So, so we're coming back. For those of you that have seen the first 5 episodes, you'll know that we have been taking a circumambulatory and slightly digressive approach to exploring the space. But I figured I would check in with Christine and see where we're going today.
Okay. So I guess just as a brief recap, the past episode, there was kind of 2 main points I think that kind of came out, which is shadow development is inevitable. And because of that, there's also this piece where rebellion and revolution is inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
Those are 2 things in terms of your process of human development. So those 2 things. So now we're going to kind of jump over. And I wanted us to there's going to be 2 main focuses that I want to talk about today. The first one is the Sandman episode. I really want us to talk about that one bit where it was in the diner and where he has the ruby and this entire exploration of the idea where he had this one perception of the ideal world being created by just getting people to stop lying to one another and to stop manipulating one another, and that the things that they were saying to each other that were nice and that were maintaining those sort of bridges was all just evil, and that if they would just stop doing that, that the world would then be good. And that dream then comes in, or Morpheus comes in, and he says that those things are actually their dreams, that they're their hopes, and that that's the stuff that sort of maintains the bonds of society, that type of thing. So I want us to explore that episode, and then I want us to kind of jump and take a very practical route just to cap this entire conversation of the shadow off, and about the specific things that you do to kind of untie yourself, or to start to untie your vision from that. And I have one idea that I would like to throw out there and to see what Anderson thinks about it. So
sounds good.
Okay.
Okay, so I haven't done the editing for that last episode, so I haven't put up the giant thing. Spoilers. But obviously, if you haven't seen Sandman, nor have you read the comic, actually, even if you've read the comic, if you haven't seen the episode, they do have a different emphasis. The episode is considerably more sort of focused on that core premise, that core conceit that Christine is referencing. So if you haven't seen it, am I required to put another spoilers thing? Can you just skip ahead? Maybe I'll wave my hands around wildly when it's safe to look again. I don't know. Whatever. We'll figure that out. That's all for post. Okay, so I'm happy to pick it up. There. So
perfect.
I think I mentioned this last time, but I mean, one of the things that jumped out at me from that sort of speech within the episode is that, and maybe this is apropos, it's kind of bullshit. Well, by which I mean that, yes, of course, it is the case that, if we make the mistake of conflating together truth with real, and we omit aspiration, right? Mm-hmm. So if the sort of magical process that Dr. D went through there was to tear away everything but the actual, right? Then, yeah, of course, you're crippling people, right? Because you can't remove the aspirational or a bunch of the other things on the sidelines. But it doesn't seem as though that's actually quite what he's getting at. Now, maybe he's got an imprecise tool, and what Morpheus is saying is you can't just strip away everything but the actual. But that's not what Morpheus says. What Morpheus says is, no, when people are engaging in social niceties, some of which are actually not designed to make the other person feel better or protect their whatever, they're just bullshit to avoid the consequences of your actual beliefs and thoughts and things. You can't strip that away. That's people's dreams. No, it isn't. That isn't people's dreams, unless their dream is a dream of non-conflict. Right? So there was something about that kind of got at me. And I mean, I'm, as I mentioned before, right? Like, I wrote an article on the redemption of bullshit, right? So I think that bullshit in the, the Harry Frankfurt philosophical sense is in some ways overly broad. It unfairly maligns a useful set of cognitive strategies. But also just, I remember back, I think I've maybe told you this before. I don't know if I've mentioned it in recording, but I remember this conference when I ran Mind Matters 2, I think. It was the only year we decided to do a 2-year. We did 2 days back to back. And it was a grind, right? It was a nightmare because we led up to the whole full first day. And then, oh God, there's a whole other day, right? So at the end of the second day, I was exhausted, like really, really quite sleep deprived. And at one point I was walking out of my office downstairs. I was talking about somebody, and somebody that was there, I mentioned something, and somebody that was there made a slightly snarky comment where they were sort of like, well, don't you think that it's important to engage in radical honesty? And my filters were too worn down to be particularly politic about this. And so I just said, of course, what I thought, which was, to be honest, I think most of the cases of people who are stumping for radical honesty are actually just an excuse for them to be an asshole, which is to say that, like, saying things in that blunt way and being, oh, I'm just being honest, is no, you're not just being honest, you're being an asshole. And, like, having a certain amount of constraint or, I don't know, the judicious application of honesty is not just deception. It's, it's sort of good practice in some ways, right?
There's a difference. Like, so this is, for example, like those who hold up democracy as an ideal, but then really all that they mean by it is just like that they would like to have the excuse to just be able to do what they want whenever they want, that it's not actually about
Go on.
So I think that there is a big difference between the kind of speaking truth and being honest with somebody when you are almost fighting against like when you're actually fearful and you actually experience the fear of the break of the relationship, that's something that you care about. And that you actually, like, you care about that person and you fear breaking the relationship, but you have a sense, you've developed a sense over time that you need to be honest with them. I think that kind of, in that moment where perhaps up until that point, all that you had been doing with that person was like being supportive and understanding of their circumstances, but then you have this like mounting feeling that, oh my goodness, like I'm lying to them. Like I have this, like this sense of like a situation that they're in and I'm lying to them. At that point, then you need to you've been swinging way too far in one direction and you need to start telling the truth. And like, then that kind of idea sort of comes forward. Yeah, I know, like, for example, my dad, when he was dying, his best friend would come and visit him every single day. They had like a mentor sort of mentee relationship. And at the end of his life, my dad was somebody who always like abide by those principles of like doing the right thing. And he was a very good manager for a mechanical engineering plant. And he did a good job of sort of balancing the values of being a leader, but then also like definitely he did so by the understanding that he was serving those beneath him, or that he was, that just because he was a manager, that his role was actually to serve those underneath, and he saw himself as being dead weight on top. So that was kind of his philosophy. But his friend would come to visit him, and my dad, on one of these days, he was getting quite upset about the fact that he was dying, as one does, and he was feeling quite sorry for himself. And his friend came in because my dad had been a little bit short with my mom. And he came in and he told him, and he was very frightened in this moment because this was his mentor. This was somebody who he respected deeply, and who was he to be speaking out of like position? But he told him that he, this might be the end of their friendship, but my dad needs to smarten up and to do the right thing because his wife loves him, and that his role right now is because his wife is coming in every single day to see him, and because she loves him and wants to spend every last minute with him, that his role is to, care for his wife, like, and to do the right thing in this time. And so anyway, that's just like, it's in moments like those where I think the tell the truth contextually makes sense, where it's not just an excuse for you to just be able to do whatever the heck you want.
Sure.
To be an asshole.
So, okay, so if we're thinking about this in terms of like, I don't know, whatever, the bare divisions in ethics, right? We can frame this as a deontological versus a consequentialist kind of thing, right? So the deontological is like certain things are right or wrong, period. It's they that is an objective feature of their nature, that they're right or wrong. And so a thing is right or wrong, full stop. And then, of course, there's a sort of consequentialist view. It's like, well, a thing is right or wrong insofar as its effects. And clearly, it's the case that most deception, right, under any kind of deontological framing is just like wrong, right? Lying is wrong. Why is it wrong? Because from a consequentialist view, sometimes people, of course, take lying, right, as being, like what they don't know won't hurt them. Right. And that can be both things. That's both lying, obviously, to somebody to preserve their feelings or something, but also lying to avoid consequences, which is where it gets into a slippery situation, right?
Yeah.
And of course, the thing about I happen to adhere. There's a lot of Aleister Crowley that I don't like. If you don't know Aleister Crowley, don't worry about it. But there is an idea, right? Do what thou, and at harm none, do what thou wilt. Right?
Okay.
And at harm none, do what thou wilt. But the hinge there is, and at harm none. So when you are engaged in a deception, the question is, when is that causing harm? And one of the maybe underrated versions of this, right, is of course that the information that you are providing or failing to provide is distorting somebody's understanding of reality in such a way as they're making decisions that might not be good decisions if they had actual, right? So, in a case like that where, your father's mentor was like, look, I'm going to push on this pretty hard and you're not going to like it, but I'm telling you this because basically, right, it's like, because you're causing harm. You're causing harm to this other person, like you're causing harm to your wife, you're causing harm to yourself. There is harm causing, and I am attempting to prevent this larger harm causing, right, by disclosing a difficult fact. Sometimes I think that's bang on. I told you about when I was in my analyst's office many years ago, and talking about whatever, griping basically about whatever. And at some point he stopped and he said, yeah, okay, but you're kind of being an asshole, aren't you? And I did not expect that from my analyst, right? Huh? Right? But it really caught me off guard. And I was like, yeah, right. You're right. I am being an asshole, right? It's an unconventional thing to tell me. It's something I've absorbed. I mention this to my own clients sometimes. You're being an asshole. Don't be an asshole. It's like, just don't do it. So again, that's something where it's like a fairly blunt, you're being an asshole, right? We didn't have to deconstruct that enormously. It was just like a shock recognition. I was like, oh yes, I am.
Yeah.
But so I don't know, maybe this raises a much bigger question. Maybe all of the like niceties form of deception, which is the thing that Dr. D in this episode is lashing out against, right? That people are either not expressing things which they believe strongly to be true, or they're deliberately saying things contra what they actually think in order to, preserve each other's good feelings. So, if somebody presents you with a piece of writing, you don't say to them, this is hot garbage and you're never going to make a dime.
Yeah.
Right? You don't crush their aspiration. But is that, in fact, are you doling out sort of false hopes? Are you doing damage to them in this process? And maybe.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, so I don't like, that's an interesting, I think that's one of those ones where it's like in a gray area where it's like, it's not really clear. And you only know after like having kind of interacted with that person for an extended period of time. Because initially it may be the case that you just want to like bolster and like support because you don't know what they're capable of. And maybe this is just like a little flame that they're starting to pursue. But Yeah, that's a weird one. I know, like, all that I know is like from my own personal, like, because I was thinking about this in terms of like personal experience and the way how this stuff comes about that he talks about as being manipulative or stuff like that. Like, I know initially when you're going out and you're pursuing something, or you're kind of stretching yourself out into the domain of the unknown, or the what is it called? Vygotsky, what is
Oh, the zone of proximal development.
zone of proximal development? Yeah, when you're initially doing that, that's when you're engaging in stuff where, like, so for example, with your father, when you're young, you may pretend that you have it all together and that you've got it all figured out. And that's just because like you're trying to like impress him. So you'll be like less vulnerable. So you'll kind of like say like these more like grand gestures. Or if you're initially trying to pitch an idea to somebody that is a stretch beyond what you're actually capable of, that you're going to say that you're capable of doing a bunch of things. Oh yeah, sure, I can do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can code that entire thing myself. Like I
Yeah.
know I know how to code some stuff, but I've never actually like coded an entire app. Oh yeah, I can do that. So like there's that. Or when you're just making friends with somebody and your aim is like to, increase your social circle, and somebody's saying a bunch of stuff that like maybe you don't completely agree with, you're going to be supportive and understanding of that, because like you're making friends, and like that's part of what it is. So that's like the piece of us that is trying to make us relevant to the world outside of us. And it's the piece of us that sort of stretches us into the unknown. And it's the piece of us that we don't have complete control of, that comes up with these ideas and says these things that aren't 100% us, but it's pulling us outside of ourselves. But then I think that there's something that sometimes happens where if we listen too much, that if we go too much into that direction, then our life becomes incredibly chaotic. And then you may have like a retraction sort of period where it's like you have to become more aligned to like who you are as an individual, something like that. And then it's in those moments where like following along with those pieces of advice, like don't lie, don't be manipulative, that type of thing, where like when you listen to that type of stuff, that then it kind of like pulls you back within yourself, and like you're able to kind of readjust your relationships. But then you again reach that point where it's like, oh yeah, okay, so now you've pulled back. But then if you continue to listen to the like don't lie, you'll never stretch yourself beyond yourself again, and you'll think that like, oh well, you shouldn't bullshit. But then that means like, okay, well then you should never tell somebody that you're capable of doing something that you can't already 100% know and do already. Like that's not the way how you live.
I guess theoretically what you could do is they could say, hey, do you think you can build this thing? And you could say, well, I don't know how, but I do learn fast. I'll take a shot, right? Which would theoretically be the honest thing. Now, I agree with you, right?
Mhm.
Being in the sort of Vygotskian zone of proximal development, right? Necessarily, it's necessarily the case that you have had an imperfect internalization at that point, right? So this is the the classic thing where philosophy students are learning how to write philosophy papers, and first year philosophy students turn in these papers that are, of course, just they're very like jargony, and right, they are attempting to do a thing, but they do it awkwardly, right? They haven't quite got the flow, but they're attempting to emulate. And the conventional sort of pedagogical move would be to squash that, right? Don't use words you don't understand, keep it simple, blah, blah, blah. But that's actually wrong. They're attempting to emulate something, and they've done so imperfectly. They haven't nailed it down. And so because of that, if you think about it, anytime you're in a growth period, I think this is what you're pointing at, if you're in the zone of proximal development, then you are necessarily sort of in the same space that produces imposter syndrome. Because there's like an interplay between what you're actually capable of and what you're getting capable of, and the fact that you aren't there yet. So so this is one of the things I tell people. It's like, if you have imposter syndrome, that's probably just a sign of growth, right? You've moved into a domain that you don't have nailed down yet. That's actually good, which means that if you're continuing to expand, imposter syndrome never goes away. right? Although your attitude to it might change, right? But is that, I'm trying to figure out if that's the same kind of thing as you're meeting somebody, you're trying to make friends, so you sort of, I don't know, go along to get along, swallow your opinion. I mean, clearly there are cases where this is not true, right? I think, you know, anybody that's played the dating game has, not literally the dating game on television, which isn't on anymore, but which I still talk about, and my students, I have to explain. It's like there used to be, no, but if you're in the sort of dating field, if you're in the dating market, right? Everybody's had that thing where they've gone on a date or something, they've met somebody, and you know, there are sort of things that they say that are like, you know, it's like yellow flags. You're like, okay, we'll come back to that. And things that they say where you're like, right, okay, now this causes me to assess what manner of situation I feel is appropriate here. But then there are things where people say them and you're like, no, I'm out.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You don't just go along to get along, right? Even, I mean, I guess you do if you're highly desirous of their company. You nod and smile and you say, absolutely. Right? But that kind of dishonesty, I wouldn't say is actually typically good. If you're swallowing your own convictions to the extent that you're sort of unwilling to allow your emotional responses to things, you know, and obviously it's possible to like not be combative, right? You don't necessarily want to be combative in a new relationship, but at the same time, I don't know, it's tricky. I mean,
so I wonder if it's maybe
therapeutically, this is something you deal with all the time.
Oh yeah.
Well, sure.
What's that? I'm going. So what I was just going to say is like I think that I think that the spot where it comes from of like the desire to like you know, you're being more understanding, I guess it comes from a place where it's like, well, maybe you don't actually hold a conviction in that area yet. You might have some instincts that are guiding you to say like, I don't know if I completely agree with that, but you haven't thought it through completely. So there's a piece of you that's still like, maybe I don't completely understand this domain, or I don't actually hold a principle in this area. So I don't have a reason to really go up against what they're saying at this time. So I wonder if maybe that's a piece of it.
Yeah. Okay. Certainly it's true that you might have, say, a difference of opinion that is perhaps not best shared, right? Because you're not attempting to establish truth propositions. So okay, I have an example. So many years ago, I was at some kind of party, or it was at a bar, but anyway, and a young woman approached me at the bar as I was getting a drink, and she opened with, you know, like, oh, I really like this band, indicating the music playing, which was the Black Keys. Okay, I listen to the Black Keys, and I don't have a problem with the Black Keys, right? I don't know if I was just in a mood. I hadn't had my first beer yet. It was a long day. I don't know. But she said this to me, and my response was, really? Because I sort of feel like they're sort of a derivative blues rock band. I'm not really sure why they've gotten as big as they have. Now that's honest, right? But talk about squashing the conversational thread. Like the you know, the rapidest, bluntest way, you know, if somebody comes up and what they've said to you is, oh, I really like this band, that's a conversational opener. If you immediately say, well, to be honest, I negate your premise, right? You have missed the level at which this interaction is supposed to be occurring.
Yeah.
Right? You're not having a debate. This is part of what I'm talking about when I would say like wielding the mind sword, right?
That's
it's
right.
Not everything everybody says is a proposition that has to be like argued or established or debated, right? And I don't know if this was a misread or I was just being ornery, but needless to say, she sort of made a sour face and walked away. And so far as I know, I never saw her again.
Yeah.
You know, so that's a clear case, obviously, where it's not like I had a lot of skin in the game about the Black Keys, right? That was just me being prickly or something. You know, clearly if, you know, I was on a date with somebody and they were like, I don't know, you know, I think it's, you know, pretty well established if we think about it, that some races are better than others. We'll see ya. Right? Come out. Oh yeah, sure. No, that's not happening, right? Or, you know, I don't know, going on a date with somebody and they're like, you know what I love? Kicking puppies. I'm gone, right? But like, So this is the, the question I'm asking. There's a go along to get along aspect to some extent. Somebody says, oh, I really like this band. Now, the proper thing to say is, like, I wasn't contesting the fact they like it. What I was doing was saying what you like is crap.
Yeah.
Which is just rude, right? And misses the game. But are there cases where you're going along to get along to establish relationship? You don't actually agree with what you're saying, and therefore what you're in fact doing is being damaging.
Yeah.
There must be. There are such cases, right? You can mislead somebody clearly into believing that you believe certain things that you do not, and that being instrumental in their assessment of you. I don't know. Well, you're right. It's a gray area.
Yeah. So what were you going to say about how you have to deal with this a lot in therapy? Like, what is, or in the clinical sense?
So, by its very nature, right? Psychotherapy is sort of predicated on rapport, right? Depending on the study, it accounts for 50 to 70% of the overall, like prediction of efficacy. Mm-hmm. And to have rapport, you have to have trust. And to have trust, one of the things that you need is that the person has to have the sense that you're non-judgmental. You have to be sort of maximally charitable. Well, what that means is that, there are, of course, cases where that's relatively straightforward, but there are other cases where you may, in fact, have some strong initial resistance to the on paper thing that they're talking about. They say, I did such and such, and you might have some resistance to that. Now, if that resistance is excessively strong and unconscious and uncontrollable, you probably ought not to see that person, right? I can't treat puppy kickers. Yeah. Right? I just can't. I'm aware of this, right? If I have a client that is like, yeah, I spent my whole teenage years, pulling the wings off live flies. It's like, no, it's not going to work. I can't respond to that with enough conscious whatever. But for the most case, right, the idea is that you interact with somebody charitably. And this goes up to and including cases where people are having pretty strong divergences from what we would think of as consensus reality, right? People going through sort of, what we would think of as psychotic ideation. Mm-hmm. People going through that kind of psychotic ideation, right? The sort of strict thing to do is to be like, well, I don't know that the universe is a black iron prison that we're trapped in by the ape of God, right? That's what you would just say, like, well, I don't think that's the case. But if you say that, what you do is you promptly shut down any possibility of dialogue. Instead, you have to listen charitably, and you have to sort of, right? It's not that you're agreeing per se, but you are taking it seriously, right? And non-judgmentally until you can move inside the envelope of trust. It's only once you're pretty far inside that envelope that you can really start pushing back. If you start pushing back on people right away, you don't typically form rapport. I mean, the rare person is coming in to be sort of scolded, but for the most part, that is not true, right? People want to be understood. Yeah. And of course, from their perspective, there's, regardless of what they've done, and this would be a non-psychotic case, people have done things that they're not happy about, right? That they're ashamed of, but the reasons that they did them were not, generally speaking, sort of malicious. And if you can't sort of get into that, and if you look at it in this deontological way, you ought never to do that. Never, right? You're never going to get through, because they typically didn't approach it being like, and now I'm going to do something evil. Yeah, like, it's totally. It's not that simple. So you pretty routinely need to employ charity so that people feel like you are accepting and non-judgmental. I've had clients and colleagues tell me that my position of charity and non-judgment is very strong. So, because I practice sort of entertaining different perspectives, I'm able to open up in a way that I think that maybe a lot of people find difficult. So I can kind of go into that space and have a decent sense of like when the relationship is strong enough to be able to push back and say, maybe there's another way to think about this, or more strongly, you're being an asshole. Yeah. Right. But first, you have to kind of go along, right? You can't just be negating premises. Okay. So it's very similar.
Yeah, that is really interesting. There's two things that come to, well, so one of them is a question of like, then like, where do you go from there? Like, once you kind of understand the context from which they are doing those actions that they have deemed or labeled as being or that evil, whether or not they actually like consciously label them as being evil, or if they just kind of feel bad about them or feel guilty about them, and where it's like more of like an emotional labeling, like where do you go from there, from the complete understanding? That's just one line. But then something else that that just also pops to mind is how this is similar to some of the work that I do with the Acton Academies, and the aim that they have for their guides, which are like their form of teachers, and their Socratic guides. And there's a differentiation between guides that are the ones that they select for that are more effective, or like kind of the aim that they're trying to go for, versus the ones that that don't quite get the philosophy. And the ones that don't quite get it are acting more as puppet masters, where they have a sense of the right way of going about things experientially. So if they see, for example, their students, you know, taking shortcuts with math, where they're just going through the Khan Academy stuff, just like memorizing it, not really actually learning it, and just like guessing and checking and just quickly going through it, that guide would then come into that instance and be like, that's a bad way of going about things. They should actually be taking their time with this. So now how can I come up with a lesson that sort of is analogous to this, so that it will trigger the insight that what they're doing is wrong, and that they should stop taking shortcuts. And that's kind of like, that's not the good way of going about it. That instead, the preferred way for a guide is for you to hold the position that you don't know the right way, or like rather that you're trying to put in context or bring forward the context for the learners in which they are making their decisions, so that then they can develop a more principled understanding or like a principled way of acting. So there are going to be instances where you should take shortcuts. There are going to be instances where you should break the rules, because like the rules are not, or like where you should question the rules. And that's like, that is what they're doing when they're taking the shortcut there with these math problems and just jumping to trying to figure out the results to get their points. They're taking a shortcut, but getting them to bring that into consciousness of like, that is a decision that you're making. That is one way of going about things. Try and understand the instances where that might be a good decision to make. And now, is this one of the instances where you think that that's a good idea? Is that like, so that then they can sort of take control over their own actions and develop a more principled way of being, that's what the guide is trying to do, as opposed to just teach them the right way.
Right. Yeah. So yes. So when I've sometimes taught in this space, I mean, I'm a great fan of shortcuts, right? The shortening of the way appeals to me enormously, right? When it's like, is there a way of compressing this to get the goods, you know? But one of the things that I sort of, you know, had to encounter around that and thus try to teach is, you know, specifically looking at trade-offs between efficiency and resiliency. Sometimes the most efficient way to sort of superficially solve an immediate problem doesn't build enough resiliency. So that example of Khan Academy would be a good example of that. Yeah, there are a bunch of things that you can very easily do to solve the immediate problem of get homework done and get a grade, right? There are ways to do it. But that immediate problem is actually just sort of proxy or synecdoche for this larger problem of having a kind of responsive mathematical flexibility and resiliency. So it doesn't build resiliency to do that, right? Yeah. Doing the actual task builds the resiliency. If you're just looking for the end zone, but that's not always an easy thing to figure out. Like sometimes you want the cheap and dirty answer, right? You want to get to something as quickly as possible because the thing that it is surrounding it doesn't matter to you, right? Yeah. Or that's not even a good example because it might not matter to you, but ideally it would.
But maybe it should. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
With lots of students, that's the case, right? They're like, well, the goal is this, so why would I do all this stuff? And it's like, but that isn't actually the goal. Yeah. That's just a proxy goal for this bigger thing. Selling them on the bigger thing is typically a harder sell, right? Trying to sell people who are not interested in math on the benefits of math literacy is, they always do the same thing. Math isn't just about abstract horseshit on paper. There are real world applications. Did you know bridges are made of math? Would you like to be a scientist with math? It's like, you're not really selling this. Same thing. You try to sell somebody on poetry, which I do routinely. And, poetry is the other end of the spectrum, in some sense, for most people. And, they're just looking for some minimal passage, right? Can I just get the damn grades? Convincing them that doing the harder work of actually developing like analogical reasoning skills and interpretive skills around poetry is something that benefits you in a broader sense. Tough sell.
Yeah.
But it's true, as much as it's true of math. I guess this comes back to the fill your head with tools. Take on things. Any individual instance isn't necessarily about the specificity of the goal. Sometimes it's about the overall process, but sometimes it is the goal.
Yeah. And you'll never know when you're actually in it. So
sometimes eating.
That's the goal.
No.
But I mean,
well, that's a goal. What I mean is literally like eating food. Food is one of these things where people cross these lines all the time. Sometimes people are convinced that they're not eating appropriately unless they go through some large procedural cooking routine, which if you're looking to lock down that bigger set of skills and general kitchen resiliency and your competency in life for cooking, great, that's fine. But sometimes that is not the question. The question is, I require nutrients to continue functioning. What is an unglamorous and non-sophisticated but minimally efficient way of meeting that need so that I can continue on with other things? And if you're always leaning on that, then you end up drinking that like Soylent shake, which sort of tastes like pancake batter. Even though it's nutritionally, I don't like it especially well, but I drink keto shakes so now and again. Sometimes the answer is you want to put in the effort to develop the overall thing, but sometimes it's just like, no, this is just a box to check to move on to something else. Sometimes I think it is actually quite discernible.
Yeah. What do you think though makes it discernible? Like, do you think, or maybe it's just like, you just know, I guess, like when you're walking through it, you'll have a sense of it. Before we go down that road though, I would like us, I want to loop back to the therapy context and like where you go from the putting their decisions into context or understanding. What is the next step after that?
After putting their decisions into context and understanding?
Yes.
Well, it sort of depends. I mean, it depends on the person and the problem and the field. I'm hesitant to give a kind of like 1, 2, 3, that's therapy answer, right? It doesn't quite work like that. But I mean, think about it this way. People start, let's say that they're starting therapy, and usually they're doing so because they have a problem, right? So something has become a problem under it's only a problem if it's a problem. So, you can think about this. As long as people don't think something is a problem, right? Drinking, then they don't care. Once it starts becoming a problem, then they start being concerned with it. The same thing might be true of, emotional interference. They have some kind of emotional blockage, or they're having some kind of unusual reaction, right? And it starts becoming sufficiently problematic to them that they're concerned with it. And usually people hit therapy at approximately the ER level, right? Very few people we just culturally, we don't tend to approach therapy preemptively very much, right? Whereas I have gradually come to think couples therapy is something that ought to occur at the beginning of a relationship.
Well, that's why that people who attended churches, they used to have like couples, what do you call those courses that they would go through ahead of time for this type of thing. Yeah. To prepare them for marriage. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, some measure of that seems to make sense to me. And of course, I adhere to a model. I used to use dentist as my metaphor, but lots of people are afraid of the dentist. So it's like, the gym or a personal trainer or the doctor. It's something you periodically maybe touch base on, check in, like it's an ongoing maintenance kind of thing, not a, oh my God, I'm at the edge of the cliff kind of thing. However, typically when people come in, they're at the edge of the cliff, or at the very least, it's begun to become quite distressing for them. Now, you can take it as a given that whatever it is that is distressing them, they don't get it. They may have a model, they often do, right? Have some manner of explanation. So very often it's the case that the issue that people come to therapy saying that they want to work on is not the issue you actually end up working on. Because if they had a clearer sense of what the dynamic and the issue was, they probably wouldn't be stuck in the same way, right? There are sort of hidden factors. But first, you get their account, right? It's like, okay, well, what's happening? And then you try to drill in on that more, right? So like explain it more, and you try to explicate it at multiple levels of analyses, right? What were you thinking? Okay, what was the emotional thing? Tell me more about this pattern as it previously occurred. When is the first time it occurred? What's the linkage between this and the situation in which you grew up, right? You're attempting to construct a general sense of this, of the dynamic. And then at a certain point, you're attempting to figure out the pain points, right? Like, where is this really, right? You want to develop a sort of mindful specificity so that, at first, the discomfort that they're experiencing around the issue is like being punched in the dark. They don't really know kind of what's happening. They have sort of a theory, but they don't really know what's happening. Then, they manage to get the lights on, and the problem then becomes that perception, the ability to detect the phenomenon, massively precedes the ability to intervene on the phenomenon. So at first, you get the lights on and you see the thing that's punching you, and you see it from the hall from a long way away with its fist up, and it runs at you, and you're like, oh no, here it comes, wham! And then it goes past, and you're like, and then you say, God damn it, it punched me. Right?
Yeah.
In fact, often you get it after the fact. Wham, click. God, it's that punching guy. then you get it in the moment. I'm being punched. Then you get click, and it's coming. This is the frustrating moment that many people bog down in therapy, because it's intensely frustrating to be aware of a dynamic but unable to intervene on it. But that is very often the case. You become aware of it first, then you can intervene on it. So seeing something coming down the hall at you and being like, oh no, like here it comes, wham, and it goes past, very frustrating.
Yeah.
Right. but the trick is you have to get that first, and then you start getting the ability to, matrix hand the bullets, right? And stop things and whatever. That's a very high level generic thing, but the move is you're getting analytical and sort of embedded and multi-level understanding first, before you're then attempting to set sort of experimental points of intervention for people to apply the very limited fund of their agency to see if you can nudge the dynamic. Is that too abstract?
No, I mean, it's not too abstract. Well, so like two things come to mind. One is that this reminds me of like, it follows the same track of the hero's journey, where they say like initially, like the hero is just reacting, and then finally, then they learn the truth, and then they are then able to start acting consciously upon it. And that seems to track with like what you're saying. And then the other thing is just a very silly anecdote that I have that this reminds me of. So I've got these very stupid nails, like they're like gel nails or whatever. And
why are they stupid?
Oh, because I've hated getting them done every single time I get them done, because it's just like, it acts against, they've been a real point of contention just because of the cost of them, and because like they're like counter to sports, and it doesn't align with who I am.
So, but this isn't something you have done once on a whim. It's something you have continued to do, despite the fact that you feel that it's at odds with sort of like your persona and your interests. And is it can I ask, is it specifically the like long nails femininity conjunction? What's it? Sorry, that's a deep question. You don't have to get into that.
No. It started out that I got them because I was going to a wedding down in the States, and I thought that would be like, oh, I should get my nails done. And then I realized that as I had that done, that it was actually because like at this time I was still feeling quite sick and was bedridden still quite a bit. And I realized that when I woke up in the morning and I saw that my nails were done, I felt like I had a little bit more energy. I was like, oh, she's put together. She's got her stuff together. So then I was like, okay, so maybe like they're actually helpful in this different way. And then as I started to get healthier and had more energy and things, then it was like, okay, well now you no longer need your nails to do that. But then they became a sign of like femininity because, or like a symbol of it, just because there's so much that I do that's like sports, and like, so I'm constantly just putting on on like athletic gear, and it's like, oh, you should probably keep your nails done because you're also like a wife. And like there's this other piece that like otherwise I kind of just will really easily just totally just toss out the window.
I don't think they revoke your marriage license if your nails are short. I don't think so. I'm not a lawyer. But
they're a symbolic reminder to me that I'm also like this
oh
other
yeah,
thing.
I'm a wife. Sorry, I'm not making fun of you. It's just it's very interesting.
It's silly, but anyway, so these nails became this like point of well, an issue because I was going to this one nail salon, and they're a very pushy nail salon. Like they
have to be, because there's like, as far as I can tell, there are exactly 1 million nail salons in the city. I cannot fathom how all of these nail salons see enough through business. Like if you drive outside the core, it's like there are nail salons after nail salons after nail salons. It really gives you a sense of the scale and scope of urban economy. But like, I don't know how they all stand business.
Well, so there's some that like are very good at what they do, and that they kind of attract a ton of customers. So this is one of them. They have people just like it's shuffling in and out. So they're constantly like their technicians don't get any lunch hours. They just like work straight through. Any moment that they have a minute free, somebody new is slotted in. So anyway, my appointment had been rescheduled. This is like this is a horrible story because it's like, oh my God, she's complaining about her nails.
No. I think this is a very interesting story. And it seems very on point to me. So, but to be honest, I actually find this transition piece interesting, right? That first it's in a piece of aesthetic attention, right, which is bootstrapping your sense of, right, and that's a thing. One of the first moves that I make anytime I'm emerging from sort of a depressive jag is typically like do something with my facial hair or my head hair. It's one of the first things I'll do. And to be honest, it's not always clear, in some kind of strictly causal sense, what's happening what. It's just that they are, they're coincident, right? There's a correlation. And sometimes I think it's like, okay, like I've been in the pits. Now it is time to shave off my mountain man beard and look semi-respectable and put on semi-respectable clothes, getting dressed, right? Throwing a suit on can make a huge difference for me. So that makes sense. And then you hold on to it as a specific signifier, but like in a, piece of red yarn tied around your finger kind of way. That's like, this is a signifier that in addition to like tomboy space or something, I also have to, this is a thing that I ought to pay attention to. So I don't think that I think it's very interesting. Go ahead.
So no, well, okay, that's good. Anyway, so I had booked in an appointment for like, it was like an hour and a half, and I was supposed to get my nails filled in as well as getting a French manicure because I'm very specific about the things that I like, and I don't like to change them.
I love getting a French manicure. Confession time. Anyway, go on. I've only had a few, but I have quite thick, strong nails. I keep my nails very short these days. Back in the day, I didn't, and people would be like, "Are you a guitarist?" And I'd say, "No." And they'd say, "Are you a cokehead?" And I'd say, "Also no." No. They're like, "So what's with the nail?" And I'm like, "I just like them. I don't know." So, and at a certain point, I realized the social pressures involved here, which were that people were like, "You look like a filthy, gross mountain man person." And so I was like, okay, fine, whatever. And now I can't stand having them long at all. My whole feeling about it's reversed. But naturally, I have quite strong, thick nails, strengthened and thickened yet further by continuous tapping. I'm a table tapper. And I actually had somebody once ask if I wanted to be a nail model, which is a whole story in and of itself. But getting a French manicure, it's delightful. I don't go for the mani-pedi, I don't, but I don't see the problem with it.
That's so funny. Well, thank you. You're really this better not be you just bullshitting me so that we stay friends.
No, 100% not. Why do you think I would bullshit myself too? I don't know if I'm going to see any detriment out of this, but it's one of those facts. It's one of these surprising things, I think, where when I say to people, it's not exactly what they associated. Like when I tell them, "Oh yeah, I used to figure skate," and right. Anyway.
Okay, so anyway, they rebooked my appointment, only they only put in time for the gel fill or whatever. And so I got there and they were like, oh, well, I hope you don't mind. You'll just have to like get your nails like, you know, just done like a solid color. And by this time, like two of my nails had already been like shaved off, so I couldn't just like walk out. And I had a flight that I had to catch. So at that point, it was like, okay, so you're kind of like forced into paying for something now that you don't want, that is like expensive. And I was like, in the moment, I was like, oh, okay. And then I went on the trip afterwards, and every single, like, I couldn't stop looking at my nails, and I was becoming viciously angry at them. And I was just like, I need to get rid of these things. And they became this like symbol of me having given in, or like having like just in my head, having been crushed by like an authority and just like not having stood up for myself. So then like I was so angry and frustrated for the first day of this trip that finally then the next day, like I wrote an email being like, this was not right. And I ended up, they never responded, which was fine. So I never went back to that salon, and I ended up going somewhere else. And I just encountered the same thing again, where they were kind of just saying like, oh, well, maybe we should, at this new salon where there wasn't a lot of time, and they're like, maybe we should just do this. And then in that moment, I was like, no, this is what I wanted, and this is what I booked. So I was finally able to sort of like get control over it, as opposed to just sort of like reacting, I guess, in a situation. And where instances of me not being able to sort of speak in the moment for that random thing that I desired that doesn't really have good reason, because like a French manicure is like a very silly sort of frivolous thing. But you know, being able to sort of stand just by the thing that you want, just because it's the thing that you came in that you wanted, and you know that you're paying for, that you know that's important. Anyway, that was a real digression of a story. So
Well, but actually I want to stick with it for a second, because it
okay.
seems to me that there's a couple of different things happening here. Like at one level, okay, at one level there is an intrinsic kind of vulnerability around the higher end of like physical aesthetic appearance management. And it's not the case that I mean, frivolous is sort of a judgmental word. Possibly it is, right? There are instances of that are frivolous, right? Where, you know, you're really into the territory of conspicuous consumption or whatever, right? It's like, this is needlessly, but there are certainly lots of instances where certain standards of appearance, right, are, you know, a kind of baseline social expectation. Like I went to a funeral once, and at the time I was homeless, I was very poor. I had one pair of boots. I had a $300 pair of Terra combat militaries, which were specifically, right, with combat tread. They were specifically designed to be robust. That was the point of them. I want to be able to walk many thousands of kilometers without my shoes falling off my feet. I was not prepared to go to this funeral. I went to this funeral. I managed to get a suit. When I took my boots off at the front door, right, the person, you know, at the house who was hosting the after reception was like, I see you wore your best shoes. Now this hurt, right? Because I was like, and I couldn't even say anything. I couldn't respond. And my father chimed in and said, actually, I think those are his only shoes. And that felt slightly better. Now I add, I have never been without a pair of proper dress shoes since, nor have I ever been without a properly pressed suit, right? And an appropriately conservative suit. As far as I'm concerned, that is like a social, it's not, that isn't just a nicety. It's a social requirement of respect, right? Now, obviously for some people that's going to be out of their range. It's expensive, but for me, it's like, you know, having that in the wings is just a bit of preparation that's, you know, good. When it comes to appearance generally, there are expectations that are placed on this, right? And all the more so if you're a woman, and all the more so if the event is a wedding. You getting your nails done doesn't seem to me like a frill. It seems to me like a social expectation, whatever you may think of that expectation. And when we put our trust into professionals in this space, and then we don't get what we want, right? Like I had a family photo 20 years ago now. I went to my hairdresser. I don't often go to the hairdresser. But I had been to this particular hairdresser for a number of years, right? They had cut my hair for a number of years. They were quite good. I had this upcoming family photo and I went in and I brought them a picture and said, this is the haircut I want, right? Pretty straightforward. So snip, 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 snip. And I am oblivious because I am blind. So that I don't know what's happening, right? I can hear noises and there is a colored cloud and I engage in a certain amount of conversation. So she finishes up and my glasses go back on and I look at it and I have, the horror blink. Ever had this with a haircut?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yes, I had. It was actually the haircut that I was getting for this wedding. That was the
lovely
same thing.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
I actually had the horror. Yeah.
That's good. So I had the horror blink, right? And the like slowly dawning realization, like I paid my $80 or $100 or whatever. And I got up to the car and I'm kind of doing this. I'm like, is there a way that I can, it is certainly not the picture. And I add, this wasn't like something I cut out of a magazine. It was a picture of me. How hard would it have been to make my hair look like this picture of me, which has my hair in it, right? So, and I, went from this kind of like denial, whatever, to suddenly realizing, oh my God, this is just a terrible haircut. Yeah. And the person that I had brought up with me then spent 2 hours in product attempting to massage it into something that didn't just make me look like a, reject stunt double from the set of Frankenstein, which is basically what it looked like. Of course I was angry.
Yeah.
Right. I have entrusted an important task, which is I need to have some minimum standard of appearance for this ritual event. Yeah. And taking a family photo is a ritual event just as much as a wedding. I don't think that's unreasonable at all. Now, the fact that transferred over and you looked at it and what that then catalyzed was this bigger rupture, which was basically like, fuck these nails, right? Right? Yeah. But then what's happening is it seems like the fault line between this thing that you don't actually sort of have the supporting value for, it's not that you want the nails, it's just that you want them to meet other kinds of needs that have to do with other people rather than your own preferences. And so the desire to tear them off then becomes a like, why would you just swallow this? And God damn it, why are you swallowing this at all? Right?
Yeah. I also think though, like that the entire thing of like engaging with those like hairdressers and other types of stuff, that is also like a creative process and like being able to kind of stand in those moments and sort of negotiate that is something that is like a useful skill to develop. And I think that's kind of like what came out of all of this was like a first step in that direction of being able to sort of negotiate on the spot of like, yeah, but not quite. I
want what I want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And like, not exactly what you're saying or not exactly what happened here. Let's adjust this. Yeah, that piece of it too. I want us to loop back, I guess, to the Sandman episode before we kind of move on, just to make sure that like we've kind of tied that up in a knot, I would say.
I saw a couple of bridges from the material we discussed around Sandman into the secondary shadow question. So I have those sort of hovering in the back of my mind. But
okay.
So are there unwrapped threads that you see there around the specific kind of scene and premise?
Well, I just think that like maybe it just to like kind of put a knot on it is just like that that there's instances where in your own personal like narrative where it will feel like you're bullshitting or being manipulative, but that is actually the heroic thing that you need to do, to step beyond again, because perhaps you've gone through like a period of sort of just aligning, like retracting, I would say like where your life has been incredibly chaotic and you are sort of taking a step back to stop lying, stop being manipulative, those things. But now you've spent a lot of time in that sort of safer space and where you're operating within your limitations and you've kind of regained a bit of stability there, that then you might perceive things as being manipulative or lying or bullshitting, but they're actually not, when what you're doing is you're learning to step back out again, to stretch yourself again, to not be so fearful. And that in those instances, you may perceive it as being, bullshitting or manipulative. And I would just say, like, as a caveat though, that there is like a piece they'll probably get to later, which is like, that when you sort of release your sense of control over things, that step into the unknown no longer actually is perceived as bullshitting.
Right.
Yeah.
Although there are versions of it that are straight up bullshitting, but also nevertheless not malign, in my opinion. So, okay, so let me run this premise. So, right, Harry Frankfurt's sort of core take on bullshitting is that the difference between bullshitting and lying, right, is that the liar is presenting sort of intentional falsehood to deceive you. And the bullshitter, primarily speaking, is unconcerned with questions of truth per se, right? But they're interested in drawing your attention in certain directions, right? It's about salience, right? It's a bit of sleight of hand. Okay. So, and part of his premise there is, right, well, okay, the way that John Vervaeke extends this in part is he talks a little bit about, like, you can't really engage in self-deception. Now, I would disagree. I think that the idea that it's incoherent to talk about self-deception, because how can you believe a thing and its opposite, is based in a presumption that we are singular unit of beings, which I think self-evidently we are not. So I think that it's perfectly possible for one part of our mind to hold one premise and another part to hold an opposing premise. That idea is not a problem for me. I think people can easily actually engage in self-deception. However,
what would self-deception be in that instance? Like, so you would be saying like that one piece of yourself would, or like that if you were sitting on the one piece of yourself, that it would perceive the other one as bullshitting or lying, but then that other piece of yourself is actually holding that as a truth. Is that like what you mean?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So there can be different pieces of your psyche, different parts, which maintain premises which they take to be the case, right? But that are directly opposed to each other. And most people, I think, have actually experienced this, where they've had, some piece come in and start telling them something that they, in a sense, don't believe, but it's sort of trying to hammer them over the head with it. Something even as blunt as like, you're a piece of shit. Nobody will ever love you. Right. And at some other level, they're like, well, that's not true. But it keeps being told to them. And it's not clear that it is a manipulative attempt of falsehood per se. It seems like that piece really believes it. Right. But that, as a whole, we don't believe it, or our conscious self doesn't believe it. Right. So there are those instances. However, there are also cases, I think, where the deployment of bullshit in this salience manipulating sense, right, interpersonally, is still totally kosher, even though, okay, it is just pure bullshit. So let me give you an example. Okay, values in the world do not have an intrinsic hierarchy, right? Values are situationally determined. Something that is, and this is one of the reasons why the sort of deontological perspective rubs me the wrong way, even though I recognized it, just that consequentialism has its own problems. But so values in the world are situational, right? It can be the case that a situation can move in such a way that such and such a value becomes preeminent, right? And this is why something like, I don't know, the Bill of Rights is something that people perpetually argue about. Never mind that the concept of rights is mostly philosophically incoherent, and we realized that in the early 20th century and then all forgot, I guess. But that in general, it's like you have to have this constant, juggling that needs to happen, right? You have to decide, situationally, which is the relevant value. And it's not as simple as, well, first this, then this, then this. This trumps everything else. Like, no.
Yeah.
Well, because of that, okay, because that's the case, if there isn't a sort of, underlying actuality, right, which is referenced to, then the question of truth in that sense is not relevant. It's not true that one value is the right answer. It's merely that some values are more sort of functional, right? And so if somebody else is making an argument to emphasize a particular value, but your sense is that actually the emphasis of that value over this value represents a poor decision for the purposes of functionality, then the argument that you're making can't be an argument from the perspective of truth, right? It has to be a salience argument. You have to be sort of pumping up the benefits of the thing that you're looking to pitch for. Right? You make people see the virtue of the virtue. The same thing goes if you think about optimism and pessimism, So you consider the studies that show, right? Pessimists see things more accurately, right? Pessimists pretty consistently in studies see things, right? Perceive situations in a more accurate fashion, and their projections are more accurate than optimists. Optimists, on the other hand, often outperform pessimists, sometimes by considerable degrees. So you could, you can go down to a value like truth, and you can say, well, the truth
Hold
is
on one
what we,
second. Hold on one second. Sorry. So pessimists will see things as they are, but then an optimist can make what they believe come into fruition. So then it will be reality. That's fun.
because, right, sometimes having an accurate perception of the situation is not maximally advantageous.
Yeah, well, that's like the idea that like there's the piece of us that is, well, it just goes back to the idea of the dream. There's the piece of us that's like our physical nature or whatever. And then there's the component of the things that is like the hope or the dream. And that you kind of like get broken out of these moments where you'll like kind of have like an awakening, and then you try and sort of push yourself more in the direction of the dream or the hope when you're when you come into frustration, or you enter into these situations where you're stuck or in your problem, or like things are becoming mounting problems around you. Yeah.
And clearly that even that axis between, I don't know, whatever, realism and projected idealism or something, that's even something you obviously have to play with, because it's not, nor is it advantageous for you to maintain a state of stirring optimism and hope when that isn't actually called for, if you're not accepting the conditions of a situation, right? Like you have to be able to slide that around too. And it's delusion. That's right. Yeah. So at what point does it become delusion? Or at what point are you doing disservice to the truth? But the sort of raw, unfiltered truth, it's like, what truth? And this is the thing. Sometimes people, I see people get hung up when they localize their metaphysics into a particular form of truth, often, frankly, not that well supported, but a particular form of truth. And then they take that to be the case and everything on top of it not, right? Like horrid genetic Darwinism, determinism. People get trapped in that space, or the space of like dead Newtonian particles. We're just a bunch of particle interactions and, sex chemicals floating around in the void, and we're trying to replicate, and that's all it is, and everything else is horseshit.
We're all gonna die, so nothing matters. It's like a nihilist sort of, right. Yeah, you get locked, you're being locked in the cycle of nature as opposed to the component of humanity, which can rise above.
Yeah, and there's a value to that. You also don't want to be out on the other far end all the time, in my opinion. You want to maintain some flexibility, but that flexibility in and of itself means that there needs to be, both for oneself and to some extent, if you're attempting to benefit others, some mechanism of shifting salience around independent of some kind of specific truth standard. And that's called bullshit, which is an unfortunate name for it. But like, rallying people to a particular value or something is not generally predicated on like a premise by premise argument. Is it cogent? That's not what's happening. What's happening, and now, granted, most of the cases in which people are being rallied tend to be a bad idea anyway. Humans should never be in groups bigger than like 20, in my opinion.
I think it's something like actually like it's 35, according to, again, with the active academies or something, like there's like a certain number where it's actually like a good number of like tribes that form within it. But then like when you get over top of that, then you start like, I forget anyway, but I think it's like 35 anyway.
Yeah, I'm concerned, of course, with the level where you start to see overarching mechanisms of collective mob mentality kick in.
Yeah.
So people's individual identity drops away and is fused into something that has no intellectual capacities. It just defaults into a, like a giant squirming
us versus them sort of
smash organism. That I'm less down with. Anyway, so I think there's more room in there for us to explore, but and of course it is sort of gray area, but it seems to me like there are, and this plugs right in to the point in the Sandman. It's like some of the things that Dr. D tears away are things that indeed I think we can agree are sort of pernicious.
Yeah.
But a bunch of it, this is the point, is like, no, it's not that simple. Just because something is not actual doesn't mean that it's not valuable.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. I think that we'll leave that there so that we have enough time to go on to the second question,
Right.
which is this piece about how you actually sort of how you begin to strip away this stuff, or how you begin to deal with the shadow, to see the ways that it's interacting with your meaning landscape, that sort of thing. And when I was initially considering this a few episodes ago, I was coming at it from the angle of like, okay, well, how do you identify when you're in a situation where things are going wrong? Because in those moments, you think that you're pushing for something that's really good or right. And like initially I thought that like, okay, well, the one thing that's like a through line between all of those is that you're moving further and further into like isolation from life or something like that. And then I was like, well, I don't know if that actually works, because there's instances where people need to mount a rebellion or need to revolt against the persisting authority. And then that will actually necessarily lead them to have to make a bunch of decisions that ruffle relationships and that, put them perhaps like temporarily more in isolation. So I don't know if that's necessarily like a good metric for identifying the situation. So then I flipped.
Well, I'm inclined to think sometimes moving away from connection and even moving away from what seems like the current and wellspring of life is important.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's sort of, it's ascetic and slightly cleansing, and can get your, right, you pull out of the dynamic that you're stuck in a bit and can see to what extent it's actually required, and therefore to what extent you actually, like, do I really want to participate in things in this way, right?
Yeah, it's pulling away from attachments that you currently have, because you like things that in the past transformed you in some way, or people that transformed you in some way, that after you spend a lot of time in those relationships, you develop like the sense of responsibilities and loyalties, at least for me. And then I actually had to kind of part with those ways temporarily to be able to see the world more balanced, I suppose. So yeah, so like you're saying, like that didn't seem like a good enough thing. And then the only thing that I could really come up with after that was to act on a dream and commit to it. And that would be the thing that you could do at any instant. That it's not about identifying when like the right moment is for, like when it's like when you're in a bad situation or anything like that, that's just, you can't do that really. That instead it's like, if you start getting these like reoccurring dreams or longings or things like that are coming to you, to try and actually figure out a way to accomplish that. And just like one of them or something, that engaging in that process will put a frame on your life such that you'll start to see the ways that your shadow is interacting with it, and that you can start to deal with it. The one example that I'll give, and then I'll toss this over to you to see what you think and for you to add other ideas in, is that when I was going through that experience with you, I think we talked about in episode 3, where it was the dissolution of my career as it was, and my dad passing and all those other things, that the one reoccurring thought that I kept having was how much I wanted to be working in a space where I was connected with people more. Like I wanted some type of connection. So whether it was like just going outside and like working in a coffee shop or something, like I needed to have human connection, and to change my work over so that there was human connection within it. And that led me to start cooking more this was during lockdown and COVID. I started cooking for my in-laws and the whole family, making these big meals, helping out a lot more around the house. And by doing that stuff and engaging in conversations with them more, it started to shake up my way of thinking surrounding the business negotiations and everything. So it was this chaotic process that sort of ensued as I was trying to pursue the goal of greater connection with people, that any of the ideas that I initially had of the way how that would actually look ended up being wrong. It wasn't like my job was going to become like cooking for people. That wasn't it. It like after that, then I started working with the youth hubs, and that wasn't even the end goal of it. It wasn't working with those teenagers. And so it's your initial image of that is not what ends up solving the problem, but rather there's a whole bunch of stuff that's outside your control that as you're trying to pursue that thing, that starts to help pull away the pieces of your shadow. And it happens not from you sort of being able to top down identify those moments and figure those things out, but rather from the pursuit of that and that definition that it kind of produces. That's a bit abstract, but what do you think? And what are your other thoughts around it?
So, so when I think about this, I think about that there's a couple of different threads here to me. So the question of shadow work, when I think about it, is about, so what's the shadow in these terms? The shadow is all the rejected contents of the ego. And some of those things need to be incorporated to form a more nuanced self notion, right? To a more realistic and nuanced self notion, and one that's a little less polarized, right? Some of it needs to be incorporated because it's material that was abandoned or left behind. I'll come back to that in a second because it plugs very specifically into what you were talking about, right? And and some of it obviously is about like the fundamental recognition of your horrific potentials or whatever. But a lot of it is just about like, look, here's some shitty things you did. You need to absorb that. Some of it is about, here's a bunch of stuff you left behind or unfairly maligned. That's in and around shadow work. And when you're talking in a kind of aspirational persona through to imago mode, much of which, when I think about it, sort of would come after the initial shadow work. So let me unpack that. Let's say that in the same situation, you were, you had been in the trenches, so to speak, and not working with other people, connecting with other people, because you held a relatively strong view that doing work by yourself, and so it was virtuous, and working in groups was either a waste of time or sort of lazy. It's like, only leaning on a team is right. That's shadowy material, right? And the way to know the shadowy material, right, is in some sense pretty grounded, right? Because it's about emotion. Shadow shows itself in emotion. It shows itself in fear. It shows itself in rage. It shows itself in disgust. And it shows itself in contempt. All of the emotions that reject, right? So the fear emotion rejects, and like a lot of the time, if shadow material shows up that way, in dreams and things, shadow material will frequently show up as terrorizing figures, right? Dark, menacing, ominous, that you run from, right? In that case, you're looking at the manifestation of fear, and so fear and the shadow can obviously be quite tangled. But when you're dealing with a shadow projection, usually it shows up as irrational, hatred. And when I say irrational, I mean, all emotions are sort of irrational, but what I mean here is like disproportionate, unearned, inappropriate. So shadow material, you would typically know, right? It's a complex because it's way out of proportion to the stimulus. And kind of it's in and around the shadow because of the nature of the emotions. When you mention a topic and somebody goes off about it, and they're clearly extremely like angry or rage filled, that's shadow. That's shadow projection right there, right? And if that pushes over into the space where they start expressing disgust, right, and then contempt, like those are very strong rejecting emotions. So if the situation you were talking about was one you were like, you had either fear of working in groups, rage at the concept of groups, or like complete disgust and contempt for interpersonal work, right? Then it might be the case that, having sort of noted that you have this, you might attempt to move towards it by undertaking, being like, I think this is something that's really missing for me. You might look back to childhood or something and be like, actually, I used to love being in groups until that one day when the coach said to me, you'll never be team captain. You're not a team player. And in order to avoid the bruise on my emotions, I was just like, you're goddamn right, I'm not. And you went the other way. Like, that's typically how the shadow material would show up. Then the move towards seeking to incorporate that, right, is kind of secondary. You're often figuring out kind of a kludge. So with shadow material is a little trickier, right? You can attempt to shift your assessment of the thing in question. So this is sort of sensibility transcendence. Okay, so the classic version of this is you have a woman and her daughter-in-law seems to her like a loudmouthed boor, right? Mouthy, loud, rude, uncouth, right? But then she undergoes some amount of sensibility transcendence, which is to say she charitably reinterprets the traits. Well, she's not loud, she's exuberant, right? She's not blunt, she's honest, right? And you recontextualize. You're draining out the venom, the moral venom that's attached, that sense of wrong and bad that's attached to the trait. So if you had a sense of wrong and bad attached to group work, right? Then, you know, draining that out might be something you were like, well, what could I do? What can I do that's pro-social, right? Cooking big meals for my family. You can make that move with regard to other sorts of archetypal dynamics that you're exchanging with too. So when I was doing my own work around the anima, right, the contrasexual soul image of the anima, so my inner feminine, such as it is, an experiment that I ran that ended up being quite successful was that I made an identification that a trait that I considered to be feminine, appealingly feminine, was baking, right? No doubt from my mother.
Yeah.
Right, so baking, such that I could identify that, like, you know, my high school girlfriend, if she was like baking cookies or muffins or something, it activated this large scale sense of like, you know, it wasn't just sort of libidinous, like it wasn't just sexy. It had a sense of like, I want to, you know, like contain you and protect you, and you are a woman, and, you know, like this kind of thing. Like it activated a lot. It activated the sense of femininity in a broad scopes kind of way. So when I was looking to incorporate this work, what I started doing was baking bread every day. So I did baking, right?
Yeah.
I consciously took on a thing that I associated in this way. I attempted to sort of inhabit it. And in so doing, began to sort of absorb it in myself, right? It stopped being an other. Baking is something women do, right?
Yeah.
And it became like, dual baking is a thing also I can do, and therefore I am pulling these traits back. So if it were the case that you had a bunch of negative emotional shadow material, right? If somebody's like, okay, and we're going to put a small team together to work on this, and your response was for the mercury to rise through, and they're like, can you believe this? They put me on a fucking team, right? And it's like, what's wrong with a team? I don't want to work with a team. I work best by myself. Teams are a waste of time. And frankly, they're just going to get it right. Then it's the case that, you know, doing something where you're like, well, what if I attempt to do something in the team space? I do something that is group, pro-socially oriented, cook a large meal, start to work at the kids center, etc. And that's gradually pulling in or shifting the sense around that particular value.
Okay, this is interesting. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So
which then expresses itself once the value gets recalibrated or something, right?
Yeah.
Then that tends to express itself in future developments. But often it's the case that you don't start by going straight at the thing. You have to sort of coax the value into shifting. And all the more so, not that we have time for this right now, but all the more so if the reason that value ended up in the shadow to begin with is shame.
Yeah.
And then the recalibration of shame is a sort of a tricky art of its own in shadow work.
So this is interesting. So I think like there's two directions here. Like what you've highlighted is kind of when people start feeling this or more like externalized kind of emotions that come with the shadow, which is like the anger, like anger at the group or anger at the thing that's like outside of themselves. For me, I know when I was doing this, like the attributions that I was making was that to be able to work alone is to show great resilience and resolve, and that there was definitely the stuff in there of like group work is that it's not productive, that a lot of times like those conversations that you have are going to lead you astray from the work that you're doing. And if you're not able to,
did you ever have harsher language for it?
No, but it was just more like, it was kind of like a personally, you should be stronger sort of thing. Like if you're not able to do this, and if you're getting distracted at this moment, it's because you're not strong enough. You just need to develop more willpower.
Okay. So the way the value tracks is it's not about the group per se, although it very easily could transition that way. It's that to be in a group equates to a kind of weakness.
Yeah, it's, yeah, exactly. But yeah, but you don't, yeah, that's exactly it. That it's weakened versus like to do this is strong. But that was like an internal thing that then resulted in like a sense of withdrawal as opposed to like an anger. And I'm just thinking like, so for somebody who has more of this like externalized sort of sense that they could do shadow work by identifying instances where they are excessively angry, would that be something that, like, I'm just trying to like nail down sort of the way for people to kind of like identify circumstances that then they may need to like consciously sort of move into a bit more, like in the way how you're demonstrating the example with like baking, but like, or like with group work or things like that.
So in both cases, there is a negative emotion that is being disproportionately and inappropriately evoked by a stimulus, right? The difference is, I mean, you know, there's the old saw, right? That anger turned inwards is depression.
There we go.
Okay, well, we'll wrap this up then quickly.
Yeah, we'll finish up this loop. Yeah.
Anger turned inwards is depression. So one of the most frequent sort of emotional exclusion patterns that you see in people is an inability to sort of experience anger normally, or an inability to experience sadness, and they tend to flip between each other. There are people who, instead of experiencing the appropriate sadness in a moment, will experience anger, right? And people who will vice versa, right? They should be experiencing anger given the conditions, like that's what you would expect, but instead they experience sadness. And it has to do with this, you know, directionality in some extent. If you take the same thing and you point it outwards, it becomes anger. Fuck you. But if you point it inwards, it typically becomes a crumpling kind of sadness and distance, right? And an othering, a pushing apart. So it sort of sounds like the dynamic is just, you know, you're being an introvert. You're focusing that in an inwards way. The dynamic is exactly the same in a certain sense, right? You're having a disproportionate and to some extent unearned response to the group situation, right? And in this case, it's because of an excessive positive emphasis, right? Solo work has this excessive positive emphasis. Therefore, group work by definition picks up the shadow of that as a negative emphasis. But instead of that negativity localizing, I mean, I'm a little speaking for myself here, right? When I say fucking groups, blah, 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 right? Traditionally, I have not liked group work. In job interviews, if they say, how do you feel about working on a team? I say, well, I work well in a group and better by myself.
Yeah.
Right, which is my preferred mode. And a lot of that links back around to precisely what you said. I just don't want anybody to tell me what to do. I just want to do it my own way and at my own pace and at my own standards of quality. And I don't want to debate those things. And this is something I've spent quite a few years overcoming, much as you're talking about, right? Like allowing myself to work in collaborative forums and things when I have felt burned by that quite frequently, especially in my early career. So, you know, so for me, it's in this particular case, externally directed, right? Except the odd time that I collapse and implode a little bit and I'm like, oh, I'm experiencing negative feelings and it's your own fault, right? Which is that flipping back around. For you, you're experiencing it as an internal feeling. You're experiencing sadness, loneliness, right? Distance, right? That kind of coldness, lack of connection, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it sounds like maybe this wasn't so strongly expressed for you that you weren't kind of aware of it anyway. So it wasn't deep shadow regardless. It was a sort of imbalance that you could pick up to some extent, right?
Yeah.
But you weren't sure how to act on, as opposed to being like a massive revelation, right? But at the same time, you know, the basic mechanic of it is the same. You're picking up a disproportionate or inappropriate negative emotional reaction to circumstance stimulus. And then you're starting to ask questions about that in generalized terms. What is it about this situation in the abstract that provokes this, right? When you start to drill down into that, you start to pick up the places that you have these assumptions, biases, preferences, right? In the strong version, but it's stronger than preference. It's more like bias. You'll have a bias in a direction. And when you really start to interrogate that bias a little bit, if you're honest about it, often you're like, well, is there an actual rational basis for what I'm saying? Or is it just made of feeling tones, Like, is there really a reason to lean one way or over another? Really?
Okay, so in instances where you're having these sort of strong negative emotional reactions, and like I kind of want to ask a couple questions surrounding that, but I'm cognizant of the time, so we'll bump it to the next episode. But just to cap it off, in these instances where you're having those extreme biased sort of negative emotional reactions, to sort of start paying attention to the circumstances under which they come about, that there's likely some type of pattern in them, that there's operating around some theme, for example, like group work, or some category, and that what was the last piece you said? I'm sorry, my brain just kind of
Oh, no, it's okay. So you're identifying this disproportion in some way, you're drilling into it, and after you play this game for a while, you start to recognize that there are some common types, right? Am I experiencing the strong emotion outwards because it is a thing about myself that I won't acknowledge and therefore am projecting? Is it something that I have a previous association with that has unfairly generalized, right? Scalded monkey fears cold water, right? This, like, the overgeneralization of a small set. So do I have an unfair assumption about the negativity of something based on a too small a set and, right, previous experience? Is it something that I have been hand delivered, directly told over and over again should be part of my values without me actually interfacing it against the particularities of my own experience? Right? So there are a bunch of standard ways to look at this, but you're trying to sort of drill in and be like, well, what is it about this? Why does it have this effect? And for many people, getting access even to the level of their emotions and their preferences and their assessments is one thing, right? That's quite difficult for many people. But then you go a level under and you start asking the question, well, why? Which is a skill that you can practice in all kinds of other areas and then apply backwards, right? I like to do this with people. It's like, what's your favorite movie? What's the movie you watch over and over again? You know, people have them. Why? What is it about it? Right? And almost always it provokes a consistent emotional effect. And I'm like, yeah, go through and take notes on yourself. Watch it and see where you react. And then when you get to that scene and you react this way, why? Why are you reacting that way? What is it about that scene that is so activating for you? Right, in whatever direction, such that other people are like, I don't know what you, right? So as an example, you know this, and my partner was the first person to really pick this up. I cannot watch a depiction in animation or film of Superman taking flight for the first time without weeping. And this is not a negative form of weeping. I'm not sad. It's an I am overwhelmed with feelings form of weeping. But it is invariable. Not every time he takes flight, period, right? Otherwise, I would just be crying through those movies. It's the first time. The first time in any piece of media, it's that I am taking flight for the first time moment will invariably cause me to weep. And I'll be honest, I don't know why. I would totally know why.
Our current social media stuff that we have of things like Instagram or what is that one where you create boards?
Oh, you're asking the wrong person. Jib jab.
Why can't I? Anyway,
Instagram, Pinterest.
Pinterest.
See, I got it.
Pinterest. Where you create boards, and you could totally do this to yourself thanks to Pinterest, where you'll start to see like themes of how you're, or like the things that you react to, and you just take a look at like a month of your reactions, and you just come to be like, oh, there's something going on about me here.
But first the patterns, then the like, okay, why? And I don't think it was always obvious. Same thing, Spotify playlists. Pop open your Spotify, look at your playlists. What are your playlists? What are the genres of music that you like to listen to? What are the genres of music you don't like to listen to? What are the emotions that you experience? Because most people will organize their playlists, if not around some kind of relatively high concept cutesy poo theme, they will do so around an emotional core. So people will have a I just broke up playlist, or an I'm about to get lucky playlist, or I need to get shit done today playlist, right? And those things clearly have some shared features, right? A particular driving beat or motivational whatever. Like there are reasons, but they are designed specifically. The playlists are designed to be a throughput of stimuli that reliably provoke an emotional state in you. That's what they're doing. So you can go through that and both be like, okay, which are the ones that I have? Which are the ones that I don't? Why don't I? What is it about this emotion that why is it not represented?
Yeah.
You know, and then why? So it's the same thing, right? You can pick up a pattern in your response to something, but that doesn't necessarily, right? For the most part, people don't pick up those patterns. They don't really notice, right? Then, so you first train to pick up the pattern, and then you start asking like, well, why? Like speculating, what is it? What is the connection? What is the shared form in some sense, or the resonance, or the echo, or the rhyme between this and my life?
Yeah.
Why does this resonate with me? So it's the same thing with that kind of shadow work. And then beyond that is, okay, so how do I bring myself to that or get closer to it? How do I do the value shift? And that is more on the side. Maybe that's for next time.
That's for next time. Yeah, I like this. I like where we left this. This is great.
Right. Okay, good. So that was lovely as always.
Yes.
I hope everybody tunes in next time. I super want to show them my boots, but that's why. Why do I want to do that? It's a product review.
Can you just like pop them up?
All right. So I'll just say I was talking to Christine. So sometimes the conjunction of two sets of interests leads you to a purchase. Is it a good idea? You don't know necessarily. But for many years, I have wanted a pair of Fluvogs. An old friend of mine is actually related to John Fluvog. I've been to the Fluvog's location in Toronto many times. I've looked at Fluvogs online. I've admired people's Fluvogs. And one of the things I've always had is, even when I've considered buying them, I found that they've often been sort of too stylishly garish. It may not surprise anybody in the show, but I'm not exactly a fashion plate. I tend to run pretty simple, very basic in that sense. So I just never could find a pair of Fluvogs that I was sort of willing to make the jump on. But every once in a while, you get a conjunction and two interests come together in just like a beautiful way. And so when Fluvog offered their Strange New Worlds boots, because Fluvogs makes all the boots for that show, which, if you like Star Trek and you haven't seen it, it's the best Star Trek in 25 years. I've been so far down the Star Trek rabbit hole for the past 3 years, I didn't really even have a choice. This was a completely unconscious decision. And these are, you know, they're nice, they're pretty basic in some ways, but like also they're sort of strange. And like, look at the toe on that thing. Anyway,
fantastic toe.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm excited. I'm not just going to wear these on Halloween. I'm going to see what happens. But can I just, in my day-to-day life, walk around in a pair of Starfleet boots? We'll see. Anyway.
And hopefully we'll have video evidence of it.
Well, it's a bit early to go full costume on the channel, I think. Right? I think, didn't I pull out the phaser and the thing? Anyway, there's plenty of unintentional geekery exposure here. I guess I'm not with the bookshop behind me. I'm probably not successfully hiding anything. Anyway, lovely as always. I hope people, including you, obviously, Christine, will return for the next installment in which we will attempt to pick up this thing. So you nailed down your shadow. You caught it by the foot. Now what? So tune in next time. And here we have some salmon swimming against the stream. That one's doing a thing. That was exciting. I caught that. They're trying to jump. See, this is a fish ladder. You can see it's naturally set up such that they can make their way uphill. So there's some at each stage. Can you imagine? What an exhausting way to have children. It's amazing though, really. And so they swim all the way upstream to spawn. But first they have to get up these little hoppity hips. Hippity hop, hop, step, stop.